grieved for someone you've never met, like a piece of your own soul suddenly went missing. When Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, passed away, the world didn't just lose a rock icon. It lost something deeper. Fans across continents mourned as if they'd buried a brother, a friend, a wild heartbeat that had always been there, pulsing in the background of their lives. For days, the music world stood frozen in sorrow. Ozzy's face, those heavy eyes, that mischievous, aching smile, seemed to haunt every screen, every radio wave, every quiet corner of memory. He wasn't just a once-in-a-lifetime talent. He was lightning in human form, unfiltered, unpolished, unforgettable. But this loss wasn't just for the fans. It was Sharon's heartbreak too, one carved slowly over decades of love, fire, and forgiveness. In his final days, Ozzy didn't dream of applause or the roar of the crowd. What he feared most was silence, the idea that Sharon might one day stop hearing his voice. He couldn't stop death, but he could leave her a gift, one that would speak when he no longer could. A quiet act of love that no one else knew about until now. Before we look back at his life, let us raise our hearts for a moment. At 1 p.m. on the 30th of July, 2025, the city of Birmingham fell silent. Ozzy's funeral procession moved slowly through Broad Street, his family leading, a sea of black behind them. Faces stained with tears. Grief so heavy it made the air thick. But that wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a goodbye the world still isn't ready for. Before the last flower was laid, before the final note of music faded into memory, there was a moment, a still, aching pause. The world mourned Ozzy in public, but behind that global grief was a quieter, more devastating sorrow. Sharon's. In those final weeks, it wasn't the flashing lights or the sold-out arenas Ozzy yearned for. It was the sound of her voice, the rhythm of her care, the softness of her presence. His life had been wild, chaotic, untamed. But at the very end, all he wanted was her. The woman who had stood by him not through the easy, but through the impossible. And Sharon, she knew. She knew the goodbye had already begun, even before his last breath. Every cup of tea she made, every tremble she held his hand through, every pillow fluffed, every whispered, "I'm here," was a quiet scream of resistance. She was losing him, moment by moment. But she never stepped away, because love doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it's just staying, even when it breaks you. At exactly 1 p.m., the 30th of July, 2025, time stood still in Birmingham. Ozzy Osbourne's funeral procession moved slowly through Broad Street. His family led the way, Sharon, silent but unshakable, followed by a river of black. Thousands lined the sidewalks, not as fans, but as mourners. Some clutched old records, others held candles. All of them carried grief. There were no loud chants, no rock anthems blaring. Just the sound of footsteps, the occasional sob, and the overwhelming weight of loss. Faces were soaked in tears, but there was reverence in the silence. Ozzy didn't just belong to music, he belonged to them. Their anger, their joy, their chaos, their healing. It wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. And yet, in that moment, you could feel it. This wasn't really a goodbye. It was the start of something quieter, something deeper. A legend may die, but his echo never does. In the last days of Ozzy's life, the estate he once filled with music and madness became silent, so silent it felt like even time held its breath. Gone were the late-night jams, the loud laughter, the chaos that once echoed through the halls. What remained was a hush that blanketed every room like a quiet prelude to grief. Outside, the countryside stood still. Inside, the air was thick with things unsaid, memories unspoken, love bracing for loss. The house didn't feel alive anymore. It felt suspended, like it was waiting. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of wind outside the windows felt heavier than usual. Sharon moved quietly through the stillness, her every step a prayer, her every breath a refusal to let go yet. This wasn't just the calm before death. It was the sacred quiet of love standing watch. Ozzy's bedroom became his final stage, but this time there was no crowd, no lights, no sound, Just one narrow window where morning sun crept in quietly. Just Sharon, always there, always close. She didn't leave his side, not for a second. Each morning, she made his tea strong, no sugar, just the way he liked it. She sat with him, fluffed his pillows, dimmed the lights, and held his hand as each tremor rattled through his fragile frame. Parkinson's had stolen almost everything: his strength, his speech, even the small ability to feed himself. But it never touched his eyes. Those wild, stormy, mischievous eyes still flickered with life. "This body's finished," he rasped with a ghost of a grin one night, but the brain's still partying. He was fading, but inside, he was still Ozzy, still the rebel, still the spark. And Sharon was still the flame that never left him in the dark. Sharon never cried in front of him. She couldn't. Her soft smiles were armor, because behind each one was a scream she refused to let him hear. How do you stay strong when the love of your life fades in front of you, not all at once, but slowly, painfully, piece by piece? She watched him drop a spoon, miss his mouth, struggle to whisper her name. But the heaviest weight he carried wasn't physical. It was in his eyes when he realized he could no longer protect her from his own decline. Some afternoons, he stared out the window for hours, lost in places only he could see. Back to Aston, back to one freezing room with 4 siblings, coal dust in his lungs, and Lennon's voice crackling through an old radio. The past wasn't just visiting, it was flooding in, uninvited and relentless. And Sharon held on, silently collecting each memory. Not to escape the present, but to remind him that even as his body betrayed him, his life still mattered. Sharon read him old letters. She whispered stories from when they were young. She played recordings of the kids, Jack's giggle, Amy's sweet hum, Kelly calling him my rock star daddy. And Ozzy cried, not loud sobs, just slow, quiet tears that slipped down a face once painted for war. It was the kind of crying that breaks you without a sound. "Don't let them remember me like this," he whispered one night. "Not in this bed, not like this." Sharon didn't answer. She couldn't, her throat locked, because in that moment she understood he wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of being forgotten as a shadow of himself. She wanted to scream, to bargain, to fight the inevitable, but there was nothing left to do. No fame, no doctor, no act of love could stop what was coming. So she held his hand tighter and smiled through the ache, because that's what he needed, and she would never let him feel alone, not even now. Some days, Ozzy barely spoke, but when the memories came, they poured out like a flood. He drifted back to the bitter cold of Aston, 4 kids in a single room, lungs coated in coal dust, dreams barely formed. He remembered the exact moment John Lennon's voice first reached him. It wasn't just music, it was a key. He chuckled weakly, recalling the first Black Sabbath rehearsal. "I thought I was going to throw up," he said. "But they screamed, Sharon. They screamed." The memories didn't come in order. They came in emotion, joy, shame, fire, forgiveness. And Sharon caught each one like fragile glass, afraid they'd slip through her fingers forever. She knew he wasn't just recalling the past. He was retreating into it because the present was too heavy, too real. So she stayed, not to pull him back, but to go there with him. She played recordings of the kids when they were small. Jack's laugh, Amy's soft singing, Kelly calling out, "My rockstar daddy." Ozzy listened, head tilted slightly, eyes closed, then the tears came. Slow, aching, silent. They carved through his pale face like time itself. This was the man who once walked on stage like a warrior, face painted, voice thunderous. But here, in this room, he wasn't a god. He was just a father, one who knew he was leaving too soon. He held Sharon's hand tighter, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't let them remember me like this." She didn't cry, not where he could see, but inside, her heart cracked open, because the truth was unbearable. He was still her storm, still her legend, still the love of her life. And she was already mourning a man who hadn't left yet. Ozzy was slipping away, not in one final moment, but little by little. And Sharon felt every second of it. She knew no doctor, No money, no miracle would stop it this time. Even love wasn't enough. Still, she showed up day after day with steady hands and a quiet smile, as if her presence alone could hold him together. But grief had already begun wrapping around her, slow and suffocating. It started long before his heart stopped, when his voice got thinner, when the tremors grew worse, when he began forgetting how to be Ozzy. And yet, there was no scream, no breakdown, just quiet moments stretched into goodbyes she wasn't ready to say. She swallowed her sorrow whole, because he needed her strong. He had always been the storm, and now she was learning how to love through the silence he would leave behind. He was slipping, and no one, not even Sharon, could stop it. The woman who had weathered decades of addiction, betrayal, chaos, and fame stood beside him now in a battle she couldn't win. The stronghold she'd always been was now quietly unraveling from the inside. With each breath he lost, her grief deepened, not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow drowning. She smiled for him, touched his face gently, made him tea, held his hand, all while swallowing the truth. This time, there was no comeback, no next tour, no encore. But even as the world braced for his passing, something else stirred in those final hours, something softer than grief, but more powerful than any stage light he'd ever stood under. A promise, a final gesture, a love too deep to fade with the body. When Ozzy took his final breath, he didn't just leave behind a name, he left a legacy fierce, flawed, and forged in fire. His estate was valued at over $220 million, but that number barely scratched the surface. It wasn't just built on platinum records or sold-out tours, it was built on breakdowns, relapses, and brutal resurrections. Each dollar earned carried a scar. Every album was soaked in pain and power. The reality shows, the headlines, the chaos, they were just the surface. Underneath was a man who turned survival into spectacle and rebellion into gold. More than 100 million records sold. His voice, sometimes snarling, sometimes cracking, spoke to generations who never felt seen. Ozzy didn't sell perfection. He sold truth, wrapped in noise and darkness. This legacy wasn't polished. It was lived in, it was bled for, and it will echo long after the world goes quiet. Ozzy's homes weren't just luxury, they were survivors too. Each one bore witness to the chaos, collapse, and comebacks that shaped his life. In Buckinghamshire, his countryside manor stood proud but haunted. It even had its own private rehab wing, a reminder that even rock gods need somewhere to fall. In Sierra Towers, his penthouse rose above the noise, offering him solitude in the sky. Beverly Hills and Hancock Park held mansions wrapped in the wallpaper of breakdowns, breakthroughs, and battles fought behind closed doors. These addresses weren't just real estate, they were memory maps. Silent observers of every stumble and every resurrection, not monuments to success, but to survival. In every room, the walls didn't echo with fame, they pulsed with fight. Beneath those mansions lived monsters on wheels, Ozzy's beloved machines. His cars weren't just transportation, they were declarations. An Audi R8, sleek and black like midnight oil. A Ferrari 458 that roared louder than any crowd. A Rolls-Royce Phantom that didn't just carry passengers, it carried ghosts. And then there were the vintage British beasts, reminders of where he came from. Grit, grease, leather, and lightning. Each car was a reflection of his chaos, beautiful, loud, impossible to ignore. They weren't trophies. They were pieces of the man, torn between speed and stillness, between luxury and the soot of Birmingham. Because Ozzy never wanted to be admired from a distance. He wanted to be felt like horsepower in your chest. None of the platinum records, the property, or the polished chrome defined Ozzy more than what they represented. They were proof that a boy born into soot and struggle in Birmingham could scream his way into eternity. That rebellion could be legacy. That raw pain could become art. Even as life dimmed, it wasn't luxury he clung to, it was impact, resonance, the echo he knew would outlive him. His fortune wasn't indulgence. It was defiance, a monument not to excess, but to endurance. Because Ozzy Osbourne didn't ask to be eternal. He earned it. In early 2024, while his body began to surrender, Ozzy's mind stayed sharp. And with quiet clarity, he signed his final will not out of fear, but out of fierce intention. At the center stood Sharon, his anchor through every storm, and his 5 children, each named with care, each provision thoughtful. But what made this will remarkable wasn't what he left to them, it was what he gave beyond blood, to people he'd never met, to battles he once fought alone. Because Ozzy didn't just leave behind wealth, he left behind direction, a map of who he was and who he wanted to help next. It wasn't just a farewell, it was one last act of rebellion through compassion. Ozzy knew what it meant to be broken, to be lost, before anyone noticed you were missing. So in his will, he carved out more than inheritances. He carved out lifelines. He left generous endowments to mental health organizations, the kind that catch artists before the stage swallows them whole. He supported youth programs that give kids second-hand guitars instead of second chances too late. He gave to the ones like him, the ones whose pain doesn't show on paper, but screams in silence. Because Ozzy never forgot who he was before the spotlight, and in giving back, he made sure that others might make it further than he ever did. Ozzy's compassion didn't stop with people. His will reached even further to the voiceless. A significant part of his estate was pledged to animal rescues and lifelong shelter funding. Not for publicity, not for legacy, but for love, because when the world judged him, barked headlines and whispered gossip, dogs never did. They simply curled up beside him and stayed. He once said, "They loved me harder when I deserved it least." That tenderness, the kind that few saw, was Ozzy's quiet truth. And with every paw print he protected, he said thank you to the creatures that never asked for anything except to be near him. The day after Ozzy died, a bouquet of white lilies arrived at Sharon's door. No card, no name, just the scent, sharp, soft, unmistakable. He used to say, "You smell like lilies when you laugh." She assumed it was from a friend, a fan, but then came another and another. Same time, same wrapping, same aching beauty. By the third morning, the florist called gently. "These were arranged in advance, Mrs. Osbourne," she said. "They'll arrive every day, for the rest of your life." That's when Sharon broke not with a sob, but with a silence so loud it cracked through the house. Because this wasn't for the world, it wasn't for cameras or headlines. It was for her, and only her. Tucked away among his things was a small, handwritten note. It wasn't grand, just simple, quiet, devastating. "Even when I'm gone, you'll never be alone." That was it. Sharon found it days after the flowers began. Folded like a secret, sealed like a vow. Not part of the will, not meant for the public, just a whisper meant only for her. This wasn't about legacy. It wasn't about forgiveness or fame. It was love raw, complicated, and deeply human. The kind that survives betrayal. The kind that outlasts disease. The kind that says, "I see you. I remember. I'm still here." And for Sharon, that note wasn't closure. It was a beginning of life without him, but never truly alone. Ozzy didn't just leave her a note. He left her a ritual. He chose lilies because they bloomed in the morning light, just like Sharon always did. He made sure there'd be no end date, no condition, no pause. As long as she breathed, they would arrive. One bouquet, every day, not for show, not for the cameras, for healing, for remembering, for saying, "I'm sorry," the only way he knew how. Because Sharon had pulled him back from the edge more times than anyone knew. She had stitched together the man behind the myth again and again until her hands were bleeding, and still she stayed. The flowers weren't romantic. They were repentance, wrapped in white. At 1 p.m. on the 30th of July, 2025, Broad Street in Birmingham fell silent, then erupted in sound. Ozzys Funeral wasn't mournful. It was musical. There were no organs, no hushed sobs, just fans in black, eyes gleaming not with grief, but with memory. There were no hit songs, no Crazy Train, no Bark at the Moon. He hated greatest hits compilations. "They make me want to crawl into a bin," he once growled. Instead, speakers played A Day in the Life by the Beatles, a song Ozzy said unraveled and rebuilt his soul in 4 minutes. As his casket moved through the crowd, the city became his final stage, not for goodbye, but for one last, chaotic, beautiful performance. Because Ozzy wouldn't have it any other way. Inside the private service, there were no dramatic speeches, no scripted sorrow, just presence. Sharon wore solid black, timeless, stark, like grief had been stitched into the fabric. Around her stood their children, Jack, Kelly, Amy, Lewis, Jessica, each holding stories instead of tissues. When Ozzy's voice crackled through the speakers, "If anyone's crying like a soggy muppet, I'll come back and slap you," the room burst into tears and laughter. His humor, his timing, his spirit, it was all still there. Sharon pressed play on one more clip. Softer this time. "Don't be too sad, love. I'm just backstage having a pint." That moment didn't need a eulogy. It was one. It was him. And it was perfect. Outside, the band played Black Sabbath, not loud, not wild, but slow, soul-drenched jazz. Iron Man became a hymn. War Pigs whispered like prayers. Fans didn't just listen, they became the choir. A man lifted his shirt to show a trembling tattoo. Ozzy's signature inked above his heart. Another whispered, "He saved my life when nothing else did." Because Ozzy's true gift wasn't just music, it was reflection. He held up a mirror to our messiest parts, our chaos, our shame, and made them sing. He showed us that even darkness can carry melody, that even the broken deserve to be heard. As the music rose, the grief didn't feel heavy. It felt holy. Ozzy wasn't great because he was polished. He was great because he wasn't. He bled in public. He failed out loud. He loved fiercely and fell hard. But he always stood back up, and by doing that, he gave the misfits and the shattered something rare. Permission. Permission to be messy, to be human, to hurt and still keep going. He didn't preach slogans. He preached scars. Every relapse, every raw lyric, every tear, he wasn't ashamed to cry at all, added up to one message. Survival is its own kind of rebellion. And in surviving, he didn't just stay alive. He kept the rest of us breathing too. Ozzy never wanted to be a role model. "I'm just still here," he once shrugged. But that was the miracle. After prison, poverty, addiction, shame, he was still here. Still standing. Still singing. He redefined what it meant to be human under the spotlight. Not by hiding his demons, but by holding them in the open and saying, "This is me, and I'm still worthy of love." And by doing that, he made the rest of us believe maybe we are too. His greatest legacy wasn't in platinum records. It was in lives pulled back from the edge, in people who stayed alive because his pain reached them first. He didn't offer perfection. He offered proof that redemption is real. Behind every legend that burns bright is someone who carries the flame. For Ozzy, that was Sharon. She wasn't just the woman behind the man, she was the storm shelter when the world crashed in, the one who stitched him back together when everyone else let him fall apart. While the world cheered his madness and mocked his pain, Sharon stayed behind the curtain, in the silence, not out of duty, out of love, fierce, quiet, relentless love. She forgave what no heart should be asked to, not because she was weak, but because she believed broken people still deserve redemption. And every time he shattered, she picked up the pieces with bare hands, bleeding but steady. Not for applause, just because she loved the man even when he couldn't love himself. Ozzy didn't walk through life. He roared. He stumbled, bled, broke, and somehow turned the wreckage into rhythm. He wasn't a saint. He never tried to be. He was raw, chaotic, deeply human. And that was the point. Legends don't die. They fracture the world just by leaving it. And in the quiet after the storm, we realize we're not crying because he's gone. We're crying because he was real. Ozzy gave us permission to be messy, to fall apart and still be worth loving. He turned pain into poetry, madness into music, survival into art. Now, the amps are off. The spotlight fades. But his voice, it's still out there. In the headphones of a lonely teen, in the laugh of a healed addict, in the silence of a woman opening the door to white lilies. He didn't leave quietly. He never could. He left the only way he knew how, wrapped in sound, dripping with love, daring the rest of us to live louder, love harder, and never, ever fake who we are.